Kevin Laumer, this is fantastic. When we were at Allegheny, did you ever have a sense that law was going to maybe be something you would be aspiring to?
Well, I think most people at Allegheny thought that. Yeah, sure, it was always an option, you know, something to look at and pursue. My brother was an attorney at that time, so, you know, I had an idea what it was like and what it involved. I realized I had very little idea after many years, but yeah, so it was on the table.
In your background, I mean, Lynn, obviously, your brother, practicing at the time, there is an age gap between the two of you guys. Mm-hmm. What kind of advice did he give you?
Huh. That's a good question. I do remember one thing he said. He said, find a niche, or niche, and, you know, take it and expand it, and you know, that's the best way to develop a practice. So I remember that, and to a certain degree, that's the way things did happen. And you can see that happen with a lot of people these days. So that's the number one piece of advice that I can remember.
Aside from Lynn, was there anybody else in your family background that was sort of law related?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all, no. As we were growing up, my father owned a lumber company, mm-hmm. and my mother was a director of food services for the West Seneca schools, so she ran the 13 cafeterias or something, but no law at all.
So Allegheny College, then how did you choose a law school?
Well, I graduated from UB, and it was very easy to choose because it only cost me $200 a semester to go there.
Wow.
Because of I had taken a year off after I graduated from and got my BA, and I went out to Lake Tahoe and spent a year out there. And in those days, when you had separated yourself from school for a year, your finances for tuition assistance were based upon you and not your parents anymore. So, you know, I didn't make peanuts out there. $20 a day they paid you. Mm-hmm. And so I was poverty stricken in the form that you fill out for tuition assistance. And so, yeah, it was $200 a semester.
So Lake Tahoe, what were you, like a ski bum out there? Were you
No, I went out there with a guy I lived with in college, and I attended bar in college to make money, and, mm-hmm. and one of the guys that was a regular, he was also a bartender at a nearby bar, and so he and his girlfriend and my friend, we all went out. There was 4 of us, and you know, we took about a month to get out there. We traveled all through the Northwest. And when we got there, you know, we had to find some work, and the only place really, you're talking about the casinos. So I ended up getting a job in a place called Harvey's Casino. Later became famous because somebody blew it up about 5 or 6 years after I left. They actually put a bomb into the place and blew it up. And so, yeah, I worked in what they call Keno, and I always said that in Lake Tahoe, you know, if you can add or subtract, they make you a change person. So they used to send people out to all the machines, slot machines, to give change out. So that was the joke. Add and subtract, you can get that job. If you can multiply and divide, they put you into Keno. If you can't do either, you were a sweeper on the floor, you know? So that was all the entry-level stuff that they had. Quite an experience, yeah.
Yeah, Allegheny served you well. What is the skill set? You know, if you're out there dealing or working at Keno, you're dealing with their people. You know, you're learning personalities, and it's a skill set.
It is, and the Keno game is quite hard because, well, I won't even get into it because it's so hard I can't even remember how hard it was, but yeah, it was a hard game. In fact, the guy that I worked next to most of the time had a PhD in math, and he was the ski bum that had taken a year off from teaching to go out there. But the thing I remember a lot about the people that worked there is from the first day I walked in, and it looked like every dealer in the place was mad or angry or something. And I found out after a short time they were just bored, and that's the way they operated. And of course they were always looking for what they call early outs, go home early on a day. They didn't want to be there, so that was life in the casino.
And you find yourself going to law school, UB Law School.
Mm-hmm.
What year did you graduate?
From UB, 78. Yeah.
78 guy. Did you know what you were going to do once you got out of there?
Well, yeah, I did, because I had done an internship in the summer of '77 with the Public Defender's Office. They didn't do internships, but what I did was through the financial aid package, they had told me, you know, we'll give you $500 towards a law-related job if you can find something like that. So I went up and, who was it I talked to? Oh, it was Richard Slater. Mm-hmm. I said, listen, I'll work here for free. You just got to sign the paper and I'll get the $500 at the end of the summer. He said, you're it. You know, and that's how that started. But Richard soon left, you know, after that. But until then, it was good, you know.
Was that subject to an election that year?
Yeah, and I believe it was Eddie Fagan that took over then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you work with Eddie then too?
Yeah. Well, how many years Eddie stayed there? Like, maybe another 4 years after I got admitted. So
you pass the bar, then you come back here and you still have a affiliation with the Public Defender's Office.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a private? Did you cast your shingle with anybody else at the time?
Well, initially I was hired before I passed the bar. That gap between the July and when you get your what do they call those things? Your little slip, you know, to get into the bar. I got in February?
February.
So, which was the normal course, and so up until that point, from August to February, I was what they call a CETA worker, and that was a federally funded program, and you know, there was a bunch of CETA workers scattered throughout the county government. So I worked there, and I was making, I don't know, $9,000 a year there. And once I got admitted, then there was a place for me on the staff there. And so I started working there full-time in February of '79. And I stayed there full-time for about a year. And then I hooked up with Richard Feasanton, and I rented space from him in the old Wellman building. And that's where I started my private practice in there.
So at the Public Defender's Office, what were you assigned to do? Were you investigative work also, or was it were you into trial prep and trial delivery?
Well, in the early internship days, you know, I was whatever they needed, do some research, go ask questions here, you know, do all this. As time went along, then when I was admitted, I you know, had my own caseload, and they give you a low-grade caseload. You know, you get misdemeanors and stuff in town courts. But I was also helping Ed Fagan with a few murder trials, and I was working primarily with the psychiatrists in the cases where they were asserting a mental disease or defect case. And that was interesting, you know. Psychiatrists are fun to work with because they're as crazy as anybody you ever met, you know.
Well, give me a case or two that we might even remember.
The Garlipo case. That's where a young man was out hunting and shot two people that were picnicking in the woods. Mm-hmm. The other one was Semenek, George Semenek, mm-hmm. who killed his girlfriend over on Lincoln Street, I think it was, in Jamestown. So, yeah. Those are the two that really stand out. There are others. But we worked with, on Semenek, I remember working with a Dr. Samuelson, who was aligned with the Gowanda Psychiatric Center, which is no longer there. And he was an older man at the time, probably my age now, you know. And then with the other case, we actually brought in a psychiatrist from the Meminger Clinic in Kansas. And that was an experience, you know, a whole different level of professionalism, you know.
You were there with Ed at the time, and though I'm not a litigator and was not in court much and don't even want to talk about those days, but Ed's relationship as a public defender and the county court judge, Adams, was colorful.
Yes, yes.
And do you know the genesis of that?
I can say that one, Ed was a Democrat and Judge Leetown Adams was a staunch Republican. I think that was one thing. Ed was brand new. He had been working in New York City for a year or two and had arranged somehow to become public defender when he left New York City. And Judge Adams didn't think he had enough experience to try cases, you know, of any significance. So he denied Ed the right to try some, you know, major cases, particularly the murder cases right out of the chute there. And that didn't go over well with Ed, and then, you know, it just went from there.
How does that actually work? So Sawyer's a classic case where Sawyer needs a public defender. The head of the public defender is Ed Fagan. How does it procedurally get to Judge Adams to say you're not qualified? I mean, Sawyer makes an application and...
Yeah, well, Sawyer wasn't one of the cases. I don't believe, because I think that by the time Sawyer was brought back here on extradition, I'm trying to think. Yeah, there must have been an overlap at that point. Yeah, so the judge at arraignment, you know, asked somebody, you know, do you want an attorney to represent you? And he says yes, and he says, well, I'm going to appoint, and it was always the public defender, but in this case it was somebody else. I believe it was Bruce Carpenter that he initially appointed, but I don't think Ed was in that office for very long after that. I don't even think Ed was a public defender when the first trial went down, but I could be wrong. That was a long time ago. That was 40 years ago. Again,
I just knew that he not had access to certain cases of renown.
Yes, yes.
And Sawyer became part of your world.
Yes, yes, it did.
How did that work? We've talked. By the way, Dobby talked about it at great length about that. So I'd love to get kind of the Kevin Laumer. How did Kevin Laumer get in about it?
That's a good question. How did I get assigned? I'm not sure. Somebody came in, I know, Richard Slater came into the public defender's office, and he had worked in the DA's office. So there was a conflict for him to represent Sawyer. So I was asked to step in. I believe it was my first murder case. And so Sawyer, between the first trial and the second trial, had been doing a life sentence in Massachusetts for another murder. And they brought him back here, and I had to work with him. The oddest thing is, he was probably the most polite client I've ever had in my life.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I remember going in to see him the first time, and I thought I was going to, meet some guy that was ready to rip my head off, but it was always, yes, sir, no, sir, thank you, please, the whole thing. Very calm, very, very odd. But it turned out then that we had to get the district attorney disqualified because Ron Gibb, who had been in the public defender's office at the time all this was going down, was down into the DA's office now. And there was cases that were really clear on that point. And so I made a motion, and they disqualified the DA's office. And that's how Daube got appointed as a special counsel. Then we made a motion to have the change of venue entered, and there had never been one granted, pre-trial like that. The rulings were always, you gotta go and try and pick a jury, and then based upon what was happening during the course of the jury selection, you could then go to the appellate division and ask for a change of counsel. But in this case, we were able to get one, and it was the first time, not only here, but in the fourth department. So everybody was a little surprised at that.
And then it was assigned to Erie County.
Yeah, Judge Marshall.
Judge Marshall. And
the elder Judge Marshall.
Yeah. How did that play out? I mean, I kind of lost track. What was the status of it at the time? Had he been convicted? Or was the conviction overturned? Sawyer, when you were...
He had been convicted here, yes.
Yeah.
And it was overturned because the appellate division said that Judge Adams didn't give him the proper warnings about representing himself. Bruce Carpenter, of course, had been assigned, and he said, I don't want this guy, I want a new lawyer. And I think, behind the scenes, he was saying he wanted to get Ed Fagan. But Adams wasn't going to do that because, it just wasn't going to get done. So Bruce was available. I can't really remember how the judge stated it, but what he stated was contrary to what the appellate division wanted him to state about standby counsel, the ability to have somebody there with them during the trial and do all these things, and a knowing waiver of any of that is what they were trying to get to, and they ended up feeling it didn't work. So after the case was reversed, and I had nothing to do with the appeal, after it was reversed, came back, and that's how I picked it up.
Then you end up in Buffalo. You make the motion for change of venue.
Mm-hmm.
Venue's changed. Go to Erie County. Your trial was about a week, wasn't it?
In length, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a week, maybe 2 weeks, part of 1 week, part of the next or something. But yeah, we stayed up there while the trial was going on.
Did you get a sense of how the trial was going on? I mean, at the time, I realize you're public defenders, you're in a defensive posture, but you have a guy, Dalton, who's well known as a litigator, but not necessarily a criminal prosecutor. Did you get a sense as this was progressing?
What was going to happen, the outcome? Well, it was almost like a predetermined outcome. The evidence was pretty overwhelming, I'd say, from the very beginning. And Dalton had the whole playbook there from John Ward's first trial. So,
wasn't there an issue regards this search and seizure issue regarding was it the gun?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it was not necessarily the gun per se, but because the gun was inside a bag.
Okay.
And there was a bunch of cases, that said, if you find a bag in somebody's closet, you can search the closet, but then you've got to go along and get more information and maybe another warrant to open up the suitcase or the bag or whatever. And so based upon those cases, yeah, we had to make a motion because the bag was found in the barn of his residence, and it had been put behind a wall, and he had, put up boards to shield it all, and his wife had noticed it, and she told the police about it, and that's how they found it. So yes, we had to make a motion, and in order to get standing, I actually had to have him sign an affidavit that it was his bag. And so that was a strange thing to do.
An admission.
You're making an admission there that it's your bag, and of course the murder weapon is found in there. The lottery tickets that were stolen from Hogan's Hut were found in there, and I think the gun was wrapped in a pair of his boxer shorts, which his wife ended up identifying at trial. So yeah, that was a difficult one there. But because she gave permission, it all went through. And then, of course, during the trial,
good sound effects, by the way.
Yeah, during the trial, this guy comes from down in the Warren area, I think, and says, that's my gun. And Bob Sawyer was in my house laying carpet about the time that the gun disappeared, and such an unusual gun. I definitely know that's mine.
Yeah.
And so that was, if the case wasn't already, going down for Sawyer, that one really sunk it.
Yeah. What's the kind of conversation? And I don't necessarily focus on Sawyer, but you've handled several murder cases. Is it things going on here? I don't know. Wait, this whole building this could be the end of our.
I don't know. I think they're looking for me. I don't know.
Tell Mary. Well, last time I heard, he was here. During the course of a trial, and you have your murdered defendant, and do you have a lot of conversation with him during the trial, or do you have your playbook pretty much saying, pretty much in place, saying, just be quiet, I got this under control?
Well, with somebody like him, he was actually a pretty bright guy. My position was I had to keep him informed of everything, especially because of all the litigation that had gone on already about, right to counsel and things like that. So in terms of what I was doing with him was, this is what I plan to do, what do you think? You got any ideas? And just make it an open process for him to be part of, when it came down to, am I going to ask this particular question or that particular question? That was my choice, but, the whole idea whether to get into this or get into that, well, for instance, the affidavit saying that it was his bag, I had to spend a lot of time explaining that to him because he was worried, like I was in the beginning, that by signing an affidavit like that, the district attorney could then come back and use it against him at trial. But I showed him where the case law said, no, you can't do that. Right. The standing motion is kind of a separate thing, and whatever is put on the record there from the defendant doesn't get used at trial.
You talked about Lynn's advice of finding a niche.
Yeah.
A niche. What point did you get a sense that Kevin Laumer's niche was going to be litigation? And because you clearly have a superb reputation in that area. Is there an aha moment?
No. It was more of well, I sort of enjoyed doing this criminal work, and you just sort of stay with it. I had no idea that I was ever going to be a criminal lawyer. That was one of those things. Well, I got this internship job. It was great. Let's do this. And you end up doing it for about 23 years on a part-time basis, but that's how it worked. And then in terms of the private practice, early on, I had started to do a lot of workers' compensation work. There was really nobody in town doing it at that point. And so that was another area, you plow into, and maybe you can develop a practice. And it worked. And from that came a lot of the personal injury practice that I ended up with in my later years. And it was a great primer, because you're learning the medical stuff, you're learning to talk to doctors and question them. I mean, there's nothing more intimidating for anybody, a young lawyer or a college student, to challenge a doctor and ask them questions. We're all kind of taught to think they're up on a pedestal, and I can't touch them. But by going through and doing that with so many different doctors in the compensation field, it just was a natural progression. So that's how we got into the civil angle of it. And the criminal angle, I've said what happened there. And it was enjoyable. But I got to say, by the end of the 23 years, it got harder and harder. And I think it got harder and harder because the defendants expected miracles after a while. Especially with like the OJ thing, and everybody thought they were going to get off after that. So it was hard. In the beginning, I sensed that a lot of the defendants, bought into the Beretta phrase, that TV show Beretta, and in the beginning they say something like, if you do the crime, you have to know you're going to do the time. And that idea was fairly prevalent in the beginning, and then it just sort of disappeared into OJ got off, why not me?
Sure. Give me the chronology of your law firms. You came back, you worked with Richard, and then kind of walk me through the your law firm affiliations.
Well, I started, as I said before, renting space from Richard Feasenton. And then I can't remember how long that went on. It started, I believe, in 1980, beginning of 1980 or so. And then shortly thereafter, we decided we'd enter into a partnership, and we went through all that financial planning. And at one point then, Richard came to me and says, I got this guy I know, and he says, I actually did a comp case for him years ago, and I think he'd be a good addition, And I said, okay. He says, well, he's in town now. He's running Stan Lundine's congressional campaign. And I said, all right. So he said, will you go out to lunch with him and see what you think? And I did, and I met Chuck D'Angelo, who's a go-getter from the word go, right? He was excited to be back. He was filled with energy and enthusiasm, and as he said, don't worry about me getting clients. I got 101 first cousins. And so it's true.
Yeah.
So then Chuck came on again as an employee initially, and within, I don't know, about 2 years later, maybe not even that long, but he became a partner with the firm. And we were over at 4th and Pine, in the 4th and Pine building, on the corner right there on the street level. And John Selstrom was our landlord at the time.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. So from there, what we did is Chuck and I used to walk around Jamestown at lunchtime, and I was always looking for older homes that might fit the bill for an office. And we found this place over on Forest Avenue, and it was owned at that time by the Historical Society, who had bought it, I believe, from the Red Cross. And they were using it for storage, and they had decided they really didn't need it anymore. So the three of us went over there, and set up practice there, and we're still there, or they are, you know. But that worked out real well. While we were there, the progression of the firm, you know, we hired, I think it was, first hire we had was Mary Schiller, Mary Barr at the time. And then we hired a couple of different people that didn't work out, and it was just sort of a short stay. There was some that we hired that stayed quite a while and then ended up changing directions for whatever reason. We had Neil Robinson come over, and Bob Booty came over at the same time.
Yeah.
They had offices there. Bob was, you know, essentially retired, but every once in a while he'd be doing an estate or a real estate case. After that, we had, you know, we brought in Lucian Ledestro and Greg Edwards and Randy Lewis. Mm-hmm. And of course, Lucian's passed on. Greg left the firm when he became county executive. And Randy is over working now for the Resource Center, council over there. Yeah. Gosh, now we hired two other ones. Neil's nephew, Andy Robinson's working there, and also Galena Duba Weaver is working there. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the list. I think at one time we had 11 or 12 attorneys working in the building at the same time. Yeah.
You're doing a great job preserving the building, let alone creating a practice. I mean, Fesman, Laumer, D'Angelo, they're a force. They've done great things. And the other things, you're really very community-minded as a firm. And I don't know what the genesis of that was, but you know, all of you individually, but collectively as well. And that's a real credit.
Well, I think Chuck was very, very interested in giving back at all times. And, you know, he certainly convinced me that that was a great thing to do, you know. And so we followed suit with that. And I remember one day at one of the attorney meetings, I said, you know, I want to have a golf tournament. And they're all looking at me, you know, like I'm crazy. But we ended up putting one together, and we ran it for 21, 22 years until I left. In fact, this would be the first year, this COVID year, when we didn't have it. Mm-hmm. So it would have kind of stopped anyhow. But yeah, that went for a long time, and that was called the Sports for Kids Golf Tournament, and the money was earmarked for local youth sporting activities where the parents were the ones that had to pay for it. Right. So we weren't giving money to the high school basketball team or anything like that. We were giving it to the, you know, the league over at the Y, or we were giving money to the soccer programs, the travel and the rec programs, and the baseball and the softball. And we got involved in cheerleading because that became a competitive enterprise, volleyball for the ladies. So that just kept going and going and going. And it was a fun thing to do. And it worked out real well for the kids that were involved, and we raised a lot of money.
Well, you did, and gave away a lot of prizes, including you winning a Phillips Lytle jacket, you lucky guy.
I'm not going to mention that you were given a jacket that said Pheasant and Laumer D'Angelo. You returned it after 10 years, but
a lot of use and wear on it. Let me pull this in front of you here. This is a composite of 1987, and as you look at some names, and what I'm looking for is vignettes, a story, not necessarily nice guy. We assume we are all nice people, but just that you may look at that and say, I was a young attorney in 1987 composite, and let me tell you a story about, it could be a Bob Booty story, it could be Eddie Fagan story, it could be whatever. You might look at a name and something pops.
Okay, well, I look at the judge row here. That's easy to start with.
Sure.
Judge Ricotta, who was a Supreme Court judge and had chambers in Dunkirk. He was from Dunkirk, but he actually sat most of the time in Buffalo. One day I went up there and I was representing an elderly Italian lady. I'm talking 80s, right? And she and her brother were having a dispute over a property line, and it was vicious to the point where the brother, put in papers that she chased me down the street with the lawnmower with the blades exposed. So that was the kind of background that we had to it, and an attorney for Buffalo represented her brother. And so we have two non-Italians representing these two staunch Italians, and Judge Ricotta comes out of his chambers and sees everybody sitting there, and he's read the caption, and he takes me and the other fellow back to his chambers. And he says, guys, I think I can settle this. It's like, great, because who's going to win this, He says, yeah, do you mind if I talk to them? We sort of looked at each other. This is not really what happens, He says, I think I can take care of it. Don't worry. So he invites the parties back. Here are these 80-year-old litigants, and we sit out front, the other attorney and I, and we're sitting there, and we hear noise out of there, and we hear yelling, and we hear screaming, and half hour later, the judge comes out and says, got it settled. So that was always interesting that and Chuck told me, he says, that judgeship, for an Italian is very important for the people in the community, because they look up to a judge that's Italian. It was a prestigious thing. So he took that and ran with it and took care of the case for us.
Well, similarly, Judge Alessi, Italian. Did your paths cross with him in city court much?
Constantly.
Yeah.
I for many years would have preliminary hearings there on felony cases. Initially it was on Wednesdays, and then it became Wednesdays and Fridays, and so we would have a hearing there, hundreds of them, literally. And I remember one, he was upset at the defendant, really upset. He didn't like what he was hearing at all. And he stood up and he says, if I could leave this bench, I'd go down there and throw you out the window. It was something I never heard from Judge Alessi. Never heard. Then a few weeks later, the case got dismissed by the grand jury. So he had a partial look at it, and he didn't like it, but the grand jury threw it out. Judge Adams, you could talk all day about Judge Adams. He was a real character, and I had the pleasure of literally working with him, for 23 years and seeing him at least every week on a Monday. He was famous for his idiosyncrasies, always wore a vest, always had his Phi Beta Kappa key hanging from it there. He loved to pitch pennies. So you go into his courtroom sometimes on a quiet afternoon, and he would take you out, and the seams in the carpet, he would use that as lines and to pitch pennies with. And unbeknownst to me, you were supposed to lose. So I learned. He used to rarely, but every once in a while, he'd let you in on some of his World War II stories, which were quite colorful. And I'll tell you the one thing that always stands out about Judge Adams, he knew his evidence rules very, very well. And when I was a second-year law student, I had taken evidence. And I had a teacher that was way off the board. You know, he was talking stuff, and I'd go and talk to the kids in the other evidence class with a different teacher, and they're doing this, real down-to-earth things to know. And this guy's over there talking about, you know, burdens of proof for a month, you know. And so anyhow, I didn't learn much evidence. After that year, I was the intern here, and I sat in on a couple of trials. Mm-hmm. And I listened to the evidence rulings and what was going on and the thought process of how to get things in and how to stop them and everything. And so the following spring, when you're getting ready to take the bar, and you take, we call them the bar bri, they call them something bar brie or whatever, getting ready to take that test, they give you a generalized test on various subjects, and one of which was evidence. And when the scores came back, I found out that I had the highest score amongst all the participants that were there in Buffalo in the evidence. And I went from a kid that knew no evidence and now I'm at the top of the class, and it's because of him, you know. Yeah, he was a bright guy. But other stories about him. I one day was in front of him trying to get him to set bail. I think it was on a extradition case. And he says, "No, I'm not going to set it." And I said, "This is a full courtroom. All the Monday morning lawyers are up there." And I said, "Well, Judge, no, you've got to set bail." "No, I don't have to set bail." And so I opened up the statute. So as I stood there in front of him and I read it to him, and you could see him just turning red because it said, "You shall set bail." And he was not any too happy about that. And the following week, I had a motion, an omnibus motion in a criminal case being heard in front of him. And since he felt I embarrassed him, he went right after me and started correcting my grammar in the motion papers. You know, should have been a period here, not, it's got a run-on sentences, you need a comma there, you know, and he was doing this. He was just being Judge Adams and letting me know that I should not cross certain lines.
Did it work?
Well, yeah. To an extent, it worked because I did a better job of my grammar. You know?
Did you ever? Just out of curiosity, you went in front of you Ricotta line, and as a result, you know, there's always the opportunity, perhaps, to after court is done, and maybe it's the last trial, the end of the day, to socialize, to go out and kibitz. Mm-hmm. You know, whether it's with counsel for the other side or with the judge. Did that ever happen with you and, say, Adams? Did you guys go out?
Adams never did that, to my understanding. A lot of that happened in the town courts, mm-hmm. between the DA and the judge. No, I didn't have that opportunity. But if you go to the bar picnic or some event and he's there, you know, he'll chat with you all night long. But, you know, otherwise, no, he was pretty strict. I mean, at lunch, you probably saw him too. He had a little magazine filled with word puzzles and things. And he'd walk down the street and not pay attention to traffic or anybody else, and he's working on that, and he'd go and get a sandwich and bring it back, or he'd sit at the end of the delicatessen counter, and so he was pretty much alone in that sense. In fact, he was known for Genesee beer. He loved Genesee beer. And there was a tavern in Forestville where he lived, and he would walk down there. And the story is that at the end of the bar, there was a lawyer's light, one of those old desk lights with a green thing on top. And he would sit there in the corner reading and drinking his beer. And I remember one day I said, "Why do you go down there all the time?" He goes, not allowed to drink at home.
Yeah,
So,
that became famous. We got to know Carol Adams very well,
yeah.
daughter. But yeah, other people, especially maybe some of the senior folks, your paths may have crossed, and I'm thinking Tubi Scarpino or maybe Mike Lombardo. I know your paths may not have crossed, but I'm just curious.
No, Tubi and Mike Lombardo, I'm not even sure I met Tubi. I remember early on, I think that he was involved in some kids were ransacking his cottage or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there was a case that went to the grand jury because I don't even know what he did, pulled out a shotgun, fired it in the air or something.
Very aware
like
of that because we had a camp in Panama also.
Yeah, so that's all I knew about him. And Mike Lombardo, I'm not even sure I ever met him either. Going through here, gosh, well, there's Phil Calla here, who is just hysterical. He's a comedian in his own right, and he's good at it. I always liked Phil. I always thought he looked like Jerry Springer, too.
Yeah, exactly.
I used to ask him, did they stop him in the airports? And he said, sometimes, Gosh.
While you're looking at that, during your time at the Public Defender's Office, you've dropped the name of Slater, Fagan. Who else were public defenders when you were affiliated with them?
Jerry Hyde was, for a short time, the public defender. I think it was less than 2 years. I don't think it was his cup of tea.
Right.
Yeah. But other than that, I'm trying to think. Slater was there for many, many, many years. I'm thinking he had to be there 16, 18 years. So I got to know Richard very well.
Was there a style that, let's say Richard had, that may be distinguished from a style that Ed had? It's just running the office, philosophies. Could you articulate that? Is it articulable?
Well, Richard was a surprise when he was appointed because he was in the DA's office. Richard was a hard-nosed DA, and when he got appointed, everybody in the public defenders were looking around saying, what's going on here, Is he going to prosecute him or is he going to defend him, But he turned into a hard-nosed public defender. He was very good at his job. He was willing to stand up and fight and do the right things, and you had to admire him for that. His style was much different from Eddie Fagan. Richard was much more conservative in his approach to life than Eddie, and that reflected in the way he ran the office. He was there, he did a lot of things, he was tending to business all the time. Eddie was more flamboyant. He was only there, a relatively short time when I was up there, and Eddie's style was to come in at noon and then expect to work till 6, and he expected everybody else to work till 6 too, even though they got there at 9 or 8 o'clock in the morning. Eddie was very good on his feet, very good. He knew what was going on in the courtroom and was able to use those skills to represent people very well. But two different personalities, both with great outcomes in terms of what they did for their clients.
Was that an aspiration of yours at some point to be the public offender?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
You like that diversity? Public defender, and then you had a private practice as well?
Yes, I did. Well, even back then, the public defender was part-time.
Okay.
Yeah. And I did serve as public defender for a few years. I did it because, I always kid him, Mike Bobstein called me up and says, I need you to do this. And I said, I don't want to do it, Mike. He says, I need you to do this. Nobody else that we're talking to can do this. You got to do it. And he kept calling me. So we finally worked out an arrangement, but I always tell him, worst thing I ever did.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed being the assistant public defender quite well. So, who else on here? Gosh. Judge Cass got mad at me one day. I think it was on a divorce matter. He did a lot of divorces over the years. And I tinkered with him, and one day there was a motion or something, and he was called upon to make a ruling, and he was talking about how he was going to rule, and I looked up at him and said, "Judge, that's not the law." He looked back at me and said, "It is until somebody in the appellate division tells me it's not." And of course, at that time, his daughter was an intern at the public defender's office, so that was kind of an awkward situation.
Yeah.
But Judge Cass he was great to work with, except when he made you come in on the day after Thanksgiving to do a divorce trial, or that was a classic. That was his attempt to get things settled.
Mm-hmm.
But I did one between Christmas and New Year's with him that didn't settle, so that was difficult. And Judge Cass and Judge Gerasi were both involved in divorces over the years, and a lot of people used to joke, myself included, that Judge Gerasi would take a divorce and just cut it up like with a scalpel and make the division here and this and that, and very involved in the case. Where Judge Cass was involved in the case, but he wasn't using a scalpel. He was using a chainsaw, and just zoop. That goes there, that goes there. All right, let's go. So those distinctions were always fun to talk about. Jeez. I look at Trip Price here, who died many years ago. But he was an assistant DA for quite some time. He was always fun to work with. Yeah. I can remember walking out of some town court, and walking around the building 2 or 3 times with him trying to settle cases. That was quite common.
So what would they say about Kevin Laumer? If I were to have Mr. Normal attorney look at this and I see Kevin Laumer, what do you think they would say about you?
I haven't the slightest idea. Maybe he was a pain in the ass. I don't know, but don't really know. What I was thinking is, I went through here, all these folks that were involved in the criminal system, either DA or public defender. So, this is what, 87 you said? Yeah. Phil's still doing it, Phil Calla. Bill Benko was a DA. Gosh, who else here? Richard Fessenden was a DA. A PD, public defender. Bill Duncanson Jr. was a public defender. John Lamancuso had interned there one year. Lynn Hartley was a public defender. In fact, I think he was a public defender right up until the time he was elected judge. Don Lynn was a public defender. John Plum was a public defender. Greg Peterson wasn't. Yeah. Trip Price, as I said, was a DA. Pat Rice was a public defender. Neil was a DA. I think John Samuelson was a public defender for a short time. Richard Slater, of course. Brian York was a public defender. Bob Van Every was a public defender. Jim Subs, of course, was DA. And David Stapleton was a public defender. So a lot of people that were involved, you know.
Well, there's always this thing that coming out of law school, if you can get involved in one of those two, you get thrown right into the mix and you're going to learn the court system very quickly.
Well, you don't know how fast you get thrown into the mix. The day after I was admitted, I was in front of the appellate division arguing a case.
Oh my gosh.
So I had less than 24 hours experience.
Well, one I'm looking at a file there that we pulled together when we had a tribute to John Ward. We haven't talked about Judge Ward. You have a war story or two with John?
I think the most interesting trial I had with John is when he was sitting in Cattaraugus County at that time where Larry Himmeline came over here and to get himself away from the DA office there, because he and John were elected at the same time. So they switched courtrooms there and caseloads so there wouldn't be any conflicts. And I think they did that for at least a year.
Yeah.
And I tried a case over there, and it was an old farmer that I represented, a big bull of a man, you know, and the guy had been charged with kicking in the town supervisor's front door or something like that. And so I tried that in front of Judge Ward, and you know, again, you know, you get the craziest things happening. In the middle at the end of the prosecutor's case, and it was it Nevins? That was the
yeah.
It was Nevins. He was prosecuting it, and all of a sudden he calls some sheriff's deputy out of the blue, you know, and he says, "Judge, I just found out about this stuff." Well, I'm just furious. I literally was pacing back and forth from the exit door all the way down to counsel table, back and forth. I couldn't believe this was happening. And what the deputies was there to testify to is, oh yeah, I saw Old Red, that was my client. Yeah, that day, yeah. Well, actually it was in the middle of the night. I remember seeing him, and you know, I was driving one way and he was driving the other, and you know, what direction was he coming from? Oh, the town supervisor's house area, you know. Oh my God, I couldn't believe this. So they ended up acquitting him. And the funniest thing, one of the jurors came out afterwards and says, "I'm sorry it took so long for us to do the acquittal. We had decided it in 15 minutes, but we had to eat our lunch first." So it took an hour to have them come back, yeah.
So I got a bunch of cases that were were part of what Judge Cass pulled together. Just wondering if you were involved in any of these things here. Recognizing you came back here around 78, 79 time period.
Yeah.
Lafferty, was that the case you were involved in?
Well, I know about the case, but that was a case, Lafferty was actually assigned counsel outside the public defender's office, or retained counsel out of Buffalo, I think. Joe Dobos, I believe, was one of his co-defendants, and I think the public defender office represented him. Bruce Carpenter, I think.
Was Calvin of Oak Knoll part of your world?
Calvin of Oak Knoll, he used to walk down the hallway outside the public defender's office all the time. I don't know why he was in the county building that office that often, but the secretary to the public defender sat right there by the hallway door, and she smoked constantly, one after another. And he used to come in and yell at her about, you know, all this smoke and this and that, and she'd sit there and light up another one in front of him. You know? So Calvin of Oak Knoll, you know, he was a different kind of guy.
Was he privately represented in those cases, or did the public defender?
I think Bruce Carpenter again represented him, but I may be wrong, but I thought it was Bruce.
Brian Blanco?
Yes, he was mine.
Is that yours?
Yeah, that was a very sad case, especially for the young lady that was assaulted. You know, she was kidnapped as she was getting into her car over at one of the local drugstores. It's now Gear Dawn, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it used to be a drugstore, and she walked out to the parking lot and got into her car, and before she could close the door, this guy came in and threw her against the far side of the car, interior of the car, and drove away, and drove her out into the woods someplace out, you know, Sinclairville or Gary, somewhere out there. Yeah, that was a very sad case. And again, you know, it was, God, they had a lot on him. They had his palm prints on the hood of the trunk. And of course, she was found inside the trunk when they found her the next day. They had his fingerprints all over the inside of the car. They had her identification. He left the scene and hitchhiked back to Jamestown, and the people that picked him up or saw him there, you know, came in and testified. You know, it was a rough case, and John Siriano was the lead investigator. He was the undersheriff. And I remember this case went to the jury sometime, you know, shortly after dinner. And it was unusual, but I think Judge Adams thought he'd get a quick conviction. Well, about 11 o'clock that night, we're all standing around waiting for a verdict, and Siriano came up to John Ward, and it was John's case. He was the DA at that time. Siriano says, "If you don't get a conviction on this, you should resign." And, you know, about 45 minutes later, 11:45, they came back, and the poor guy's mother was in the back row. She passed out when it happened, and it was a bad thing from everybody's perspective. But I believe he died in prison now.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Shank?
William Shank. Oh, that was the extradition matter, I believe. No, I didn't have anything to do with that because my brother was hearing it. So I stayed far, far away from it.
James Lewis?
James, what year was that?
This would have been 2003. Attempted murder, first degree.
I don't recall that one.
Buchanan?
Ingview?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ingview was up there quite a few times over the years. Is that the murder case?
Yeah.
I think, didn't Ed Fagan represent him on that as assigned counsel or something? I'm not sure. But yeah, no, I didn't have anything to do with it, though.
You weren't. Plumlee, that would have been. Okay.
I'll tell you one I did. Is you want anecdotes?
Sure.
Fillmore Scruggs.
Oh. Okay, go ahead.
Is that the next one on the list?
Yeah, yeah.
Fillmore was from Erie, and basically, my understanding, he was a pimp, and he killed one of these young ladies and wrapped her up in a carpet and brought her over to Westfield someplace and left her in a field. They arrested him not too much after that, but the thing that was my role in this, I was a intern again at that time. Mm-hmm. I was an intern at the public defender's office, and Ed Fagan was there, and he told me, I want you to go over and see Fillmore Scruggs every single day. That's without a doubt, you got to do that. And the reason is that Fillmore was cantankerous. You've heard of Grumpy Old Men, the movie? Mm-hmm. Well, he was 5 steps beyond grumpy, and didn't get along with anybody. In fact, he took a swing at Tony Caprino during the trial. Yeah. But anyhow, I had to go over there every day, and so I'd go over and talk to him and try to, develop a relationship with him so that he would be more forthcoming with us and easier to work with, right? Well, one day he said, I need some gum, some chewing gum. I thought, oh, okay. So can you give me some gum? Yeah. Well, back then they had the, packs, like the juicy fruits, and there were, 5 sticks in it? Well, I got them the jumbo pack, where it was like 15 sticks or something. And I gave it to him the next day. And the next time, I think that was at the end of the week, and the beginning of the following week, I'm hearing all these stories out the jail. There was gum in every lock around here. We had all kinds of problems trying to open the cell blocks. Well, it was Fillmore. He had chewed up this gum that I had given him, and he took it and stuck it inside the keyholes just to be a pain.
So you're an accessory.
I was. And I think when I told you that story a couple of years ago, I told you I had never told anybody about that one.
As you're coming in here today and you're telling Mary, hey, I'm coming to see Greg, what's the question you expect that I would be asking that I've yet to think of?
Well, I don't think that there was any specific question other than I said, I'm not going to remember most of this stuff. If he starts giving me broad questions, I don't know. What date did this happen, Kevin? I don't know. But the names usually bring back for me a lot of details of the case. But if you ask me, what was the guy that did this? What was his name? I don't know. But if you told me his name, then I'd understand the case and be able to pick up on that.
Well, there is an incident or two of a humorous nature where you're going to say, Greg, you're not going to believe this one. It could have been a ruling. It could have been one of your clients taking a swing at Tony Caprino.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. Sort of anecdotes that are good courtroom stuff.
Yeah, I think it was Blanco. Yeah, during the trial they brought an FBI agent down, 2 of them in fact, to identify fingerprints, palm prints, and all this stuff. And the lady that came down was a African American. And they put her up on there, and of course they go through the same rigmarole. They establish who she is and what she does and that she's trained and all this, and it goes on and on and on and on. And then she starts to say how, she was given these things to analyze to see if they were matches for the defendant, and on. And they just had that tendency to stretch these things out. So Blanco, as we're sitting there listening to the presentation, stands up with the jury there, the judge there, and says, when's my lawyer going to ask the bitch some questions? Oh, God, that was a tough one. And then, oh, gosh, Bucky Phillips?
Bucky, yeah.
Yeah. God, one day I went over to the jail and I had him on some little thing. I was a young lawyer there, and one of the jail guards came up to me and says, Kevin, so what's up? He says, Bucky, we caught him making out with his mother during visitation. I thought, oh my God. So that was a strange one. And then Bucky again, I have to be careful how I phrase this stuff. He was on a parole violation. This is before all this stuff where he's charged with, killing the troopers. And so they used to have parole hearings in the second floor. I think it was the second floor of the jail, in what they called the library then. It's now all cell blocks. But so right outside there, they had a couple of holding cells so that, you know, they would put your guy in there and you could talk to him, and then when you were done, they'd get him and you'd go into the library together. And at the far end of the library, they got a table set up, big long table like this conference table. And Ken Graber, who was the parole hearing officer forever and ever, sat up there. And of course, the parole officer was the prosecutor in these cases. Mm-hmm. So we open the door, we walk in, we take 2 steps in, and, you know, I see Graber and the parole officer. And Bucky says, "What's the N-word doing here?" And he didn't just say it to me, he said it to everybody in the place. And all I could think of, well, we lost this one already.
Yikes.
Yeah. So.
Did you fear for yourself? I mean, you were dealing with the defenders, you're dealing with the alleged criminals, you know, people who were sometimes had an adverse feeling about being incarcerated, and you're the guy that all of a sudden is the first point of contact. Did you ever were you ever fearful for yourself?
No. I got into an argument with one guy one time, and at the time he wasn't even my client. He had been a client previously, and he was kind of a squirrel. So, but you know, he was just all words. He wasn't going to do anything. But in the back of my mind, I wondered, it was just the one time. The rest of them were, you know, I always thought fairly grateful, you know, if you were straight with them and let them know, and they were fairly grateful and were cooperative to work with, more than likely, yeah.
Do you miss it?
No.
Yeah.
I am a happily retired man. I tell people, you know, I've got a house, it's up on a hill, and I got to mow 13 acres, and I got woods, and I got this. And I tell people, I gave up mental labor for manual labor when I retired, and that's the truth. And I'm happy up there. Yeah, it's good.
Well,
Travel a lot. It's wonderful.
Well, I'm happy you came in today.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I was a little reluctant. But you know, you could have me sit here and talk to you for hours and hours and hours if you said the right words to trigger the memory to bring back different things. But yeah.
Well, that's part of why we have the composite. That's why I have these things here, because it does trigger stories. It does trigger personalities. Did you travel much? Did you do much stuff in Erie County, in Monroe County? Did you take cases that were sort of outside the Cattaraugus, Chautauqua County region?
In terms of criminal cases?
Yeah.
No. I think the only trial I ever had in Erie County was Sawyer. Cattaraugus County, I think I had 2 over there. And it was the same guy, Old Red. No. Monroe County, no. The only time we were up there is the appellate division. This is all fairly local. Traveling was kind of a local thing. You know, I used to, back then I put 30,000 miles a year on my car, just going from town court to town court, or back to Mayville, back to here, back to Mayville. So there was a lot of travel that way. But I think one time, it was actually for the Sawyer case, we flew down to Maryland, Chinkatink, Maryland. And I didn't know it at the time, but this is a famous place for a series of books that were written for kids. And they're called Chinkatink Ponies or something. And they live wildly on the beach out there. And so we were down there on Sawyer talking to a witness. That was unusual. It certainly wasn't the rule. But we didn't have much to work with there, so we had to just...
Well, you have a terrific reputation, Kevin, and I appreciate your time, and go Gators, it's that simple.
Yeah, yeah.
Didn't even talk about your fraternity life. You notice how we bypassed all of these things?
That's good, that's
Yeah.
good.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was in a rape case and had something to do with identification, I believe. And it was an attempt to suppress it, the identification or part of it. So we're going through this thing, and Judge Adams, who always liked to run the trial or the hearing on his own, even though he was the judge, he's up there and he's listening. And he's listening, and he's listening, and he's shaking his head. And so finally, the police officer is done in terms of Scott asking him questions. And he looks at me and says, "You don't have any questions, do you, Mr. Laumer?" I said, "Well, I have a few." And I thought he was just going to blow a gasket up there because Scott had forgot to put something in, and it was a necessary thing to get it in. And he thought that I would end up opening the door and putting the evidence in, And so I danced around that because I knew what he was getting after, but that was such a good example of him trying to manage everything in that courtroom. He loved being well, he was a defense attorney. I think he's the only defense attorney we've ever had turn into a county judge,
Yeah.
but he was good at that. And I'll tell you another story. This is a story that Adams used to tell, going back to, I don't know, had to be back into the 40s or so. They used to have a place up in Mayville called the Peacock Lounge. And it got torn down when they built the Gerasi building and the Hall Clothier building. I think it sat somewhere near the parking lot now. So back in the day, they used to have, a term of court. And so everybody would come to Mayville, all the attorneys, because it wasn't as easy then to get up. It wasn't as easy as it is now to get up there. And the attorneys used to sit over at the Peacock and wait, because you never knew what was going to go on in the courtroom, and it could be hours, it could be 5 minutes. So they'd wait over there, and then the judge would call a bailiff and says, "Go get him, go get him." And on this one case, he called. The bailiff went over to get him, and the bailiff comes back. He doesn't have an attorney with him. He's supposed to bring this guy back so that they could continue on with the day. And the judge is, "What the hell's going on? Where is this guy?" Because the bailiff said, "Well, he's not coming, Judge. He's got to be here. I told him." And then he walked up to the judge and whispered in his ear, "Judge, he's got a full house and has to finish the hand." "Oh, okay." So that
Old
was,
war stories.
yeah.
Well, you've been great, Kevin. Thank you.
Again, my pleasure. Good to see you.